Fan conventions. If you live in a big city, or you're a nerd of any degree, you're probably familiar with the concept. On a given weekend, folks with similar interests will convene in a given location for a given amount of time to celebrate and explore their passions. These events can be centered around a great number of interests, from comics and games to science fiction, from anime and manga to horror films. The variety of fan conventions is every bit as broad as the varieties of fans. We're going to take a look not only at what types of conventions there are, but when and how they became what they are today. So where did this all begin? You'd probably think fandom surely didn't just spring out of nowhere, right? And you'd be correct. The first fans of fiction emerged with the first novels, namely Cervantes' Don Quixote, all the way back in 1605. However, this form of fandom was mostly on the scale of the individual. Organized fandom didn't really get going until over 250 years later, in the late 1800s, when fans of authors such as Arthur Conan Doyle of Sherlock Holmes fame organized themselves into societies, which often met in libraries or parlor rooms, to discuss the literature of the day. Around this time, authors such as Edward Bulwer Lytton, remember this guy, were also making strides in entirely new genres such as science fiction, spawning its own form of fandom. However, the first convention didn't have anything to do with either of these guys. The first event that could be argued to be a fan convention was staged all the way back in 1889, when a children's literature publisher staged an event in Brooklyn, New York. You see, in the late 1800s US, there were several periodical children's literature publications, oftentimes referred to as story papers, which were intended for boys and were sold alongside the typical adult newspapers at newspaper stands. These story papers were full of short, fictional stories that were jam-packed with action and adventure, typically in settings thought of as exotic to the average reader, such as the American West and the jungles of Africa and South America. Importantly, these papers were, as Smithsonian Magazine writer Betsy Kellum refers to them, quote, participatory in a particularly modern sense, encouraging reader participation through, quote, regular contests, puzzles, Q&A features, and letter columns, and provided a venue in which children could, for a time, feel independent, grown up enough to purchase and read their own paper. Kids could interact with editors by submitting letters or stories of their own, share a common experience with other readers, and even suggest where the story might go next, end quote. Sometimes the papers would even welcome fan-submitted stories, offering their young readers a chance to see their writing printed in a professional publication. Keep this in mind, we'll see more of that later. It was upon this backdrop that Golden Hours, one of the most popular weekly story papers, organized a one-off convention for its 10,000-member strong fan club. On March 30th, 1889, the paper rented out Palace Rink in Brooklyn for what they referred to as the Golden Hours National Convention, wherein they had several of their most popular contributors speak, including famed author Edward S. Ellis and circus magnate turned novelist P.T. Barnum, who, in addition to giving a speech, also performed magic tricks for the audience of enraptured boys, who were said to have cheered him with ferocious enthusiasm. At the time, these were huge names. Mark Seifert, writing for Bleeding Cool, notes that, quote, this would be the equivalent of having George Lucas and Frank Miller headlining your con today. With such fantastic draws, the attendance was purportedly massive, with several sources citing approximately 2,000 attendees. As far as I'm concerned, this is the first event I would refer to as a fan convention. Just a few years later, on the other side of the Atlantic, in 1891, the British would host an event shortly after the Americans, slightly different in form, and therefore argued by some to be more significant, in a pattern we'll see repeated in subsequent first conventions. Between the days of March 5th through 7th, 1891, Dr. Herbert Tibbets rented out the Royal Albert Hall in London for 3 days in order to host a joint fundraiser for his West End Hospital and School of Massage and Electricity, which sought to treat, among other things, paralysis and epilepsy through a combination of massage and electrical shocks. When it was held, this event was the latest in a series of eccentric fundraisers held by Dr. Tibbets at the Royal Albert Hall in London, with the previous such events including eye-catching themes such as an ice bazaar. However, the one in 1891 had an important distinction. It celebrated a fictional work, Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, a celebrated science fiction novel by none other than British author Edward Bulwer-Lytton, 20 years prior in 1871. This novel had captured the public imagination in the 2 decades since its publication, with a special acclaim amongst occultists and spiritualists for its fantastical themes. Many thought it contained hidden truths well into the 1940s. Being a practitioner of alternative medicine himself, Dr. Tibbets and his acquaintances were almost certainly fans of the novel, so the choice of this theme made perfect sense. Hoping to capitalize upon the popularity of the novel, Dr. Tibbets rented the Royal Albert Hall between March 5th and 7th and had it decorated with props and canvas backdrops in the style of the setting of Vril, which was an underground society whose buildings were said to resemble Egyptian, Indian, and Sumerian architecture. In the middle of the hall, Tibbets had an obelisk erected, which was modeled upon Cleopatra's Needle. Around the edges of the space, 14 vending booths were set up, offering Vril-related merchandise, refreshments, and unique event experiences, such as indoor fishing and palm reading. One of the booths even sold a beef broth elixir named Bovril, taking Bov from bovine and Vril from Vril. Surprisingly, you can still get the stuff in the UK till this day. Additionally, Dr. Tibbets arranged for unique spectacles in the event space as well, such as a young woman dressed as a princess from the novel, wearing a tiara adorned with electric lights, a fortune-telling demon dog, and mannequins resembling fantastical characters from the novel, which were moved around above the event space as though they were flying, which were propelled by a series of purpose-built rope and pulley mechanisms. Additionally featured were magic shows, dramatic readings, and a concert by a ladies' guitar band, along with an organ recital. When the event opened, the opening ceremonies, which were performed by the British Princess Beatrice and her husband, Prince Henry, hundreds of guests were admitted for a fee between 5 shillings and £1 and a shilling. In 2026 dollars, that's $55 minimum just to get in, or 41 British pounds, which honestly isn't too far off from present-day convention pricing. For the event, attendees were encouraged to participate in what we today might call cosplay, that is, to wear outfits in the style of a particular piece of fiction or history, which in the case of Vril Ya Bazaar and Fete meant wearing costumes in the style of Vril, with many attendees wearing wings, like the titular race of Vril. Still others arrived in Greek or Egyptian costumes. While cosplay is relatively common at fan events today, in 1891, it was nothing short of groundbreaking. Unfortunately, the event might have been a little too groundbreaking. While the initial buzz around the event seemed relatively strong and positive, the reviews were anything but. A reporter for the Preston Herald wrote of the event that, quote, "I found nothing very attractive or remarkable." Another writer for the periodical Truth was even more critical, writing, "A more humiliating display of witless and childish fantasticalities was never designed." Hampered by poor press coverage, attendance and interest waned on the second and third day of the event. Dr. Tibbets, seeking to break even on the considerable expenses of organizing the fundraiser, extended the rental of the Royal Albert Hall by another 2 days. However, this was not enough. Merely 3 months later, Dr. Tibbets filed for bankruptcy, with the Vril Ya Bazaar and Fete netting him a loss of £1,600, or about 350,000 US dollars, or 260,000 British pounds in 2026. Many of the sources referenced for this section, the British sources, consider this to be the first fan convention, or if nothing else, the first science fiction convention. While in the financial sense an abject failure, the Vril Ya Bazaar and Fete could be argued to be decades ahead of its time in terms of concept, execution, and scale. No other event which could be labeled a fan convention would happen again until the late 1930s, almost 50 years after the fact, and it would take even longer to approach a similar scale. It's also worth noting that in addition to being an outlier in terms of just how early this event occurred, it's doubly remarkable for who it was held for. As we'll see in many of the upcoming events, many fan conventions cater to younger people with more niche interest. However, the Vril Ya Bazaar and Fete was largely organized by and for the mainstream privileged elite of London society. If you're curious for more, there's a fantastic Mental Floss article by Alex Palmer linked in the video description. I highly recommend checking it out. By the 1920s, there was a growing public interest in science fiction literature, spurred on by authors such as H.G. Wells and H.P. Lovecraft. However, this interest was generally outside of the mainstream literature of the era. Some would say fringe, and as such, was mostly distributed and consumed through dedicated sci-fi fan magazines, later known as fanzines or even zines, which would publish short works of science fiction literature and commentary from both editors and fan mail about the previously published works, which for the first time offered fans a consistent place to offer insights and feedback. These zines were typically amateur productions of very limited circulation, with their subscribers almost always being ardent devotees of the genre. The first professionally produced sci-fi magazine, Amazing Stories, was established by Luxembourgish immigrant Hugo Gernsback in 1926. Amazing Stories provided a forum for emergent science fiction writers to publish their works, and allowed readers to submit their own articles for publication as well, additionally allowing fans to provide their own mailing addresses to be listed, so that fans of the genre could begin to write to one another by mail, beginning to lay the groundwork for some of the earliest long-distance fan correspondence. The type of correspondence which today oftentimes is centered around forums, social media, or IM platforms. Despite the flourishing of fan culture, Gernsback never could balance his books, oftentimes neglecting to pay writers and ultimately being forced to declare bankruptcy in 1929, allowing a competing magazine to buy Amazing Stories, and continue on with its publication all the way until 2005. By the early 1930s, more and more amateur fanzines popped up, with the goal of giving fans a space to network over and consume a genre of media that was difficult for them to access in such quantities elsewhere. Zines were largely established by and for teenage fans such as Forry Ackerman and Jerry Siegel, who were eager to grow the science fiction genre, and platformed almost anyone who submitted a story. Ackerman would go on to be a legendary superfan and mainstay at sci-fi and comic cons into the 2000s, and Siegel would co-create an obscure character by the name of the Superman. I wonder if we'll see him again. The rise of zines in the 1930s is arguably the singular most important development on this entire timeline. This marked the shift away from an individualistic enjoyment of fiction toward a communal enjoyment of fiction. The dialogues and relationships developed in this era laid the groundwork for every subsequent development in fan and convention culture as a whole. Though modest in scale and shoddy in quality, zines were the start of it all. As early as 1935, submitters to the American zine Fantasy Magazine were writing articles envisioning what an in-person conference of sci-fi fans and authors would look like, as well as its feasibility, and it didn't take long for things to materialize, seemingly all at once. If you can believe it, there's a bit of contention over the next few conventions, or perhaps non-conventions. One of the earliest challenges I faced when doing the research for this script was exactly what constitutes a fan convention. Mentally, I had imagined comic conventions, Ren fairs, things of that nature. But when discussing my research with others, they asked a good number of questions that I hadn't considered. Do the world's fairs count? What about the Olympics? Professional expos? These were good questions, but those events seemed to fall outside of the spirit of the project I was trying to make. Around this time, I was reading a book called The 1964 New York Comic Con, The True Story Behind the World's First Comic Convention, by Jay Ballman and Total Mojo Productions. They presumably faced a similar issue regarding definitions in their research. Very early in the text, they offer the following as what defines specifically a comic convention. Quote, "A comic convention is a comic-centric event where a large number of comic collectors meet to buy, sell, and trade comics and comic-related merchandise among a group of collectors and reputable dealers. An event that also typically includes an entrance fee, door prizes, a schedule of events, an official program publication, and professional guests who work in the comic industry." This was a good place to start, but I would need to expand the scope a bit to include other fandoms. Ultimately, I wound up with this. A fan convention is an organized event centered around media with a shared theme, typically fictional in nature, which is catered to the consumers and/or producers of said media. Attendees typically gather to network with other attendees over shared interests, along with buying, selling, and trading merchandise related to the theme of the event. A convention of this sort typically includes an entrance fee, schedule of events, an official program publication, and guests of honor who are involved in the production of the type of media the convention is centered around. For convenience, I've created a fan convention checklist that you can follow along with at home. Organized event, shared theme, typically fictional, entrance fee, schedule of events, program publication, guests of honor, relevant costume or attire, hosted in a public meeting place, such as a hotel, convention center, etc. Notably, this does not include restaurants, private residences, or things of that nature. Additionally, I'm explicitly excluding sporting events, auto shows, academic conferences, and trade expos. While these are adjacent to the spirit of what I'm trying to cover, they don't quite fit into the genre I intend to explore. Remember the whole thing about a thing happening in the US followed shortly by a similar thing happening in the UK, and both sides arguing about which one counts as first? It's about to happen again. This is where our checklist is going to come in handy. On the morning of October 22nd, 1936, a nondescript number of science fiction fans from New York City took a train to Philadelphia to meet up with a nondescript number of Philadelphian science fiction fans for a one-day event they dubbed Philcon, which was loosely affiliated with a fan organization called the International Science Association, or ISA. I say their numbers are nondescript because it was at least 9, as evidenced by the one photograph of the gathering we have. But some attendee accounts put the head count at least double that figure. Frustratingly, other attendee accounts put the figure at just that, 9. To split the difference, we'll call it an even dozen attendees, a far cry from all but the tiniest conventions of today. The astute among you might notice I called the 1936 iteration of Philcon a gathering, not a convention. Let's consult our checklist. Organized event? Absolutely. Shared theme? Yep. No entrance fee, but that's a non-issue at this scale. Schedule of events, publication, there were meeting notes published, and ISA officer elections. Tenuous, but I'll count them. You could even argue that having the newly elected club officers on site could be counted as guests of honor. No costumes, but that's not really going to be a thing for a couple decades. Let's see, venue. Oh no. A house. Philcon 1936 happened in a living room. Across the pond, similar events had been unfolding in the UK. As of September 1936, writers to the fanzine Novae Terrae had called for a convention of their own, and on January 3rd, 1937, they held what they called the First British Science Fiction Conference. Between 14 and 20 science fiction fans, including Arthur C. Clarke of 2001: A Space Odyssey fame, descended on the English city of Leeds, where they met in the Theosophical Hall to discuss various affairs of their local science fiction chapters and agreed to found a new nationwide club called the Science Fiction Association, or SFA, which was established with the express purpose of growing science fiction fandom in the UK. This feels more like a convention, but let's look at the checklist. Organized, yep. Theme, fee, schedule, publication, all the same as Philcon. Even the attendance is roughly the same. What sets this apart from Philcon, why I think it counts as the first modern fan convention, is that it didn't take place in a living room. I think I agree with the Brits on this one. This one's theirs. There's a whole page on fancyclopedia.org which addresses this issue nicely. Their editor John wrote that, quote, "It would be fairest to say that the first thing that could be called a convention was held in Philadelphia in 1936, while the first thing that must be called a convention was held in Leeds in 1937. The next couple of American gatherings drew around 30 to 40 attendees and were proper conventions by this point, since the Americans had switched to using meeting halls starting in 1937. And in 1938, the English fans had moved their cons to a London venue, which would ultimately wind up being destroyed by a German bombing raid in 1941. The American fans, on the other hand, while being spared the looming threat of a continental war on their doorstep, still managed to bring a conflict of their own to the forefront of fandom, and in doing so, began an argument that fans are still having to this day. By the late 1930s, American science fiction fandom had roughly split into two groups regarding the politicization of fandom spaces. On one side was a group of about 20 core members called the Futurian Society, led by Don Wollheim, which had put forward an ultimately failed resolution at the Second Philadelphia Convention in October 1937, which called for a resolution denouncing, quote, the advancement of pseudosciences and militaristic ideologies, and that the organization should stand for, quote, a more unified world, a more utopian existence, the application of science to human happiness, and a saner outlook on life. While on the surface these resolutions seem sensible at best and harmless at worst, it is worth noting that the speechwriter for this resolution was a guy by the name of John Michell, who fathered a movement within early fandom called Michelism. Michelism could warrant a video in its own right, but the essence of the movement was largely a rejection of the notion held by much of the fandom establishment, to the extent that there was an establishment, that science fiction served as escapism. The Michelists argued that the only way to approach the utopian vision of many science fiction authors was to advance the causes of Bolshevism, Marxism, or socialism, depending on who you asked. Regardless, the Michelist motion was voted down by a count of 12 to 8, with the 8 in favor all belonging to the Futurians, and the 12 against being non-Futurian. In the opposing camp were those who held power in this burgeoning scene. Hugo Gernsback, while not necessarily stooping to embroil himself in these spats, had put forward the very notion that science fiction served primarily as an escapist medium, which was focused on science over politics. This was a notion the Futurians denounced as, quote, the Gernsback delusion. Others would be much more active in their opposition to Michell and the Futurians. Take, for example, the club New Fandom, headed by Sam Moskowitz, Will Sikora, and Jimmy Tarassi, collectively referred to as the Triumvirate by the Futurians. In May 1938, what was referred to as the First National Science Fiction Convention was held in Newark, New Jersey, and was chaired by none other than Sam Moskowitz. The First National reached the milestone of being the first convention in the 20th century with over 100 attendees. However, it was marred by fierce debates over pro- and anti-Michelist stances, and Futurian detractors called it the Fourth Eastern Con, since no one from west of the Appalachians attended. Who did attend was Warren Scott Fitzgerald, founding president of the Scienceers Club, which many consider to be the first sci-fi fan club, all the way back in 1929. Fitzgerald stepped away from his role after a mere matter of months, but for whatever reason, he wound up at the First National in 1938. While it's true that his attendance is remarkable because he founded the Scienceers, it was doubly remarkable because, according to Moskowitz, he was the lone black attendee, and as far as I can tell, the first black convention attendee. Among science enthusiasts, there was a lot of excitement over the coming 1939 World's Fair, which was to be held that summer in New York City. At that time, the line between science enthusiasts and science fiction fans was pretty blurry. Most science fiction fans were enthusiasts of hard sciences as well as science fiction. That's why it made all the sense in the world then for the convened fans at the First National to agree to begin working towards what they would call the World Science Fiction Convention, what would later come to be known as Worldcon, which is still running to this day. By both Futurian and New Fandom accounts, the lead up to the first Worldcon was downright vitriolic. In July 1938, a handful of Futurian members of the Greater New York Science Fiction League moved to have the club send a member to the American Youth Congress, a Communist Front organization. However, Jimmy Tarassi, New Fandom member and chairman of the league, refused to allow the motion, as the organization would have had to fund the delegates' expenses. The Futurians began the impeachment process against Tarassi. However, they backed down when it appeared they didn't have the votes to win. At the next meeting, the Futurians moved to cancel Will Siroka's membership in the league, but Tarassi again blocked the motion, as his friend was not there to defend himself. Tarassi was impeached again, and this time removed from office by a successful vote. This ultimately caused the league to dissolve. This marked the formal dissolution between the two groups. The more apolitical triumvirate of Moskowitz, Siroka, and Tarassi carried on with their plan to hold Worldcon under the New Fandom banner. while the Futurians continued to voice their opposition. Dave Kyle, an outspoken Futurian heavily involved in these feuds, wrote of the period that, quote, by 1939, the bitterness was extreme. The rest of fandom, nationwide, participated to various degrees. The Futurians were the intellectuals in the fandom who were enormously active, but the controversial espousal of radical causes, especially in political thinking, diluted their popularity and leadership. The new fandom triumvirate, meanwhile, discussed among themselves what to do, if anything, regarding the Futurians. Moskowitz was in favor of barring all Futurians from the convention, since they'd been causing quite the ruckus. However, Taurasi and Sikora held more lenient stances, and no consensus was reached between the three, beyond agreeing that, quote, the Futurian group was not to enter the hall unless it first satisfied the convention heads as to its good intentions, per Moskowitz's account. On the morning of July 2nd, 1939, the day of the convention had come, and Dave Kyle, the guy whose words we just read, took the bus to Caravan Hall with a box of 200 pamphlets printed on yellow paper, which read in all caps its title, A Warning. The pamphlet was designed to be handed out to attendees of Worldcon in order to warn them about an alleged attempt by the new fandom group to put forward anti-missionalist motions, and to browbeat the attendees until said motions were agreed to. Upon getting to the convention, Dave successfully registered and gained admittance to the convention hall, located on the 4th story of its building, at which point he snuck the box full of pamphlets into the convention hall and hid them behind a radiator. Around this time, more fans were showing up to register for the convention. Most importantly to this story were the prominent Futurians, Don Walheim, Doc Lowndes, Cyril Kornbluth, and Jack Gillespie. These four took the elevator to the 4th floor, trying to enter the convention space, but were met by Jimmy Taurasi, who stopped them as they were leaving the elevator, and said they couldn't be let inside until Moskowitz and Sikora arrived. This went on for a few minutes with some pushing and shoving, but importantly, no blood being drawn, until who would step out of the elevator but Moskowitz. Wolheim, the ringleader of the Futurians, appealed to convention chairman Moskowitz to let them inside, insisting that he and the other Futurians meant no harm, and that their group was simply there to enjoy the con. Moskowitz found himself sympathetic and agreed to let the group in, provided he first speak with the one absent member of the new fandom triumvirate, Sikora. I'd like to pause here and let the viewer know that while I've pulled from alternative narratives where I can, most of this account is based on a history of early fandom written by Moskowitz in 1951. I know, almost certainly biased. However, there are some Futurian accounts of this work that say it's pretty accurate, and that most of the discrepancy from their points of view were matters of omission rather than fabrication on Moskowitz's behalf. It is with that backdrop that I provide you with this absolute gem of prose gifted to the world by Moskowitz, writing in the third person. At this point, it might be asked why the much larger Futurian group did not simply brush past Taurasi and Moskowitz, since, as they later stated, they debated the ethical grounds on which they were being kept out. Aside from the wish to enter properly, readers should be reminded that both Taurasi and Moskowitz weighed close to 200 pounds. And next to science fiction, Moskowitz's greatest enthusiasm was boxing, end quote. Dave Kyle himself wrote, quote, stocky Taurasi was ready for physical battle against those Futurians who were strong of mind, but not of body. Even so, Jimmy called for police help and waited for his two comrades. When Sam Moskowitz appeared, the argument continued, but he dismissed the police. Moskowitz had confidence in his muscle, having claimed, quote, my greatest enthusiasm is boxing, end quote, seemingly refuting Moskowitz's claim that boxing was his second greatest enthusiasm. Returning back to the elevator lobby, a scene fit for a sitcom was unfolding, as in the next group of fans leaving the elevator was none other than Moskowitz's friend and fellow fanzine publisher, Louis Kuzlan. Moskowitz writes, quote, he carried in his hand a little yellow pamphlet titled, A Warning. Quote, look what John Michel gave me downstairs before, he said as he handed the pamphlet to Moskowitz. Michel, who had joined the other Futurians awaiting entry, said nothing. Moskowitz looked over the pamphlet and, deciding that the Futurians present were indeed up to no good, went around to look for Psychora. In another sitcom turn of events, as he was running around, he spotted a box filled with colorful pamphlets stashed behind a radiator. The very same box that Dave Kyle held in his lap on the bus ride to the convention hall. Flustered but unable to find Psychora, Moskowitz returned to the elevator lobby and pleaded with Woolheim and the Futurians not to disrupt the convention, and provided them with an offer to allow them entry into the convention, provided they distribute no literature and agree not to cause disruptions. Many known Futurians accepted this offer. Leslie Perri, we'll see some of her art later, Isaac Asimov, the Isaac Asimov, and our pal Dave Kyle all agreed. But the core group of Futurians declined. Woolheim, Michelle, Lowndes, Kornbluth, Gillespie, and Pohl all left. A Futurian zine records their dinner, titled The Convention After the Convention, at a restaurant on Lexington Avenue that evening, where the assembled individuals were noted as giving various responses to the events of the day. Michel, ever the idealist, said, quote, "Psychora has won the war, we shall win the peace." Woolheim, still in the throes of righteous fury, chided, "You should have yelled at the top of your lungs," while Milt Rothman, friend of Woolheim and host of the 1936 Philcon in his living room, was noted as saying, "I don't know what I shall get for dinner." This report continues, quote, "Kyle mumbled, his mouth full of food, as Dockweiler pulled off his shoe. Doc threw it in a forward pass to Fred Pohl and yelled to the latter, 'It's Kyle's.' Fred sniffed at the shoe and said, 'Yes, it's Kyle's.'" Days 2 and 3 had decidedly less drama, and from July 2nd through 4th, the world's first science fiction convention was successfully held at Caravan Hall in New York City, marking the first iteration of what is now the longest-running international convention. This event garnered some 200 attendees, with registration costing $1, or $23 US or 17 British pounds in 2026. Funny enough, only about 150 people registered. The other 50 just kind of got to hang out for free but didn't get their names printed in the con reports. Our friend Louis Kuzlan from before, the one who handed Moskowitz the pamphlet in the elevator lobby, gave a nice write-up of the events at the convention in his zine, The Satellite. And he gives us a good idea of what Worldcon 1 was like. Fans got to meet their pen pals, and were introduced to new ones when groups went out for meals, with one group even making it to Coney Island. Forey Ackerman and his friend Myrtle Douglas, frequently known by her much cooler Esperanto name Moroho, showed up in what they called futuristic costumes of her design, in what would be the first modern iteration of cosplay. It is for this reason that Moroho is often known as the Mother of Cosplay. Additionally, several professional writers, editors, and publishers attended and gave speeches and did Q&A sessions, while some pros who couldn't attend sent in letters or telegraphs to be read. On the first day, some sci-fi films were even shown, and after that, an auction was held with such items as the original manuscript of a popular sci-fi book of the day, and some color paintings, which went for up to $4, or right around $90 in today's money. Speaking of money, the convention was a relative success financially, with the convention spending about $270 and bringing in $306 for a profit of $36 or $840 today, 630 British pounds. I'm not going to go through line by line on this expense report, but it's on the screen now if you want to look at it. You got to wonder just what someone had to do to get called a deadbeat. Now, I'm not making that up. $3 of expenses towards what is listed as deadbeats dinners. Deadbeats or not, the convention went relatively well by all accounts, and there was excitement for more cons into the future. The Michelists who had been granted admittance voiced their concerns about the more apolitical new fandom group, and attendees were noted as not being particularly pro-Michelist, but were quite strongly against exclusion on the basis of politics. Even the strongly pro-new fandom Jack Spear wrote that excluding the Futurians from the convention was controversial by and large, although the events warned of by the Futurians never came to pass. Nevertheless, it's impossible to find a critical account of the convention other than the Futurian delegation complaining of what would come to be known as the Exclusion Act. And even then, the Futurians held their own meeting at a cafeteria on the 4th of July, which drew 30 to 40 people. The closest thing we do get to a criticism of this first Worldcon is a Time magazine article published just a week after the con, which described the fans as, quote, the jitterbugs of the pulp magazine field, and poked fun at the letter columns which published these fans' letters, typifying them as reading, gosh, wow, boy oh boy, which has given rise to the now dated term, gosh wow boy oh boy, which signified juvenile overenthusiasm. Honestly, I think that's a term we ought to bring back. Even then, the Time article isn't particularly critical of the attendees of Worldcon. They published an excerpt from a Will Sikora speech where he implored the audience, quote, let us all work to see the things that we read in science fiction become realities. Sounds like Michelism, Will. Be careful. The article also notes that the pros were impressed with the character of their assembled fans, with editor Leo Margulies saying, quote, I am astonished. I didn't think you boys could be so damn sincere. It is an amusing point that this convention, called the World Science Fiction Convention, was attended exclusively by either Americans or foreign-born people presently residing in the US. Like the first national convention the year prior, it seems that this first Worldcon had yet to grow into its name. Because of that, some people called it the Fifth Eastern. But the more commonly known name in 2026 is NyCon 1. Ny being shortened NY New York, Con being Convention 1 the first. Our buddy Dave Kyle, looking back in a long retrospective, wrote that, quote, my evaluation of NyCon, by hindsight after 60 years, is simple. For all of fandom, not just the professional aspect, it was a big success. Sikora, Moskowitz, and Tarasi did as good a job as could have been expected. It's good to know that the guys who ran NyCon 1 did a good job, Dave. I wonder who will run NyCon 2. Hopefully they'll do just as good of a job. Now we know that Worldcon wound up becoming an annual convention, the longest running world convention in that regard. But it might surprise the viewer to know that it wasn't resolved to have a second Worldcon at the first convention. No, these folks had actually planned on this being a one-off event. It wasn't until Philcon 1939, that October, where the assembled delegation decided to organize a second Worldcon, this time selecting Chicago for what would be known as ChiCon. That's of secondary importance to what I consider to be the greatest contribution of Philcon 39. I'll let Fred Pohl tell the story. I clearly remember Philcon a couple years later, maybe 1939, because Cyril Kornbluth and I got silly drunk on Dirk Wiley's Applejack and stole a couple of elevators to race. It was in some sort of rental hall. No one there but us people on a Sunday. I've attempted to approach this topic as impartially as possible. However, if it wasn't apparent by now, for a while I have been a big fan of nerd conventions, as well as the sense of community and camaraderie they provide. Although, privately, I've thought this feeling was a bit silly. Time and again, however, I see that particular sentiment echoed by the people who organized and attended the cons we've looked at. Fred Pohl, sci-fi novelist and one of the 9 attendees of the 1936 Philcon, wrote of his elation over the sense of community that he felt in his memoir, The Way the Future Was. Quote, evidently, there were specimens of our own breed in other parts of the world. We had linked up with them through fanzine and letter, but we hungered for the personal contact. This was only the beginning.